Hi, so in our last video we talked about our different activity types and the different symptoms that we got on a daily basis, and we looked a little bit at how our symptoms are very closely linked to the types of activity that we do moving through the day. And we talked about our types of activity as being physical activity, mental activity, social activity and emotional activity. And as the day goes on, we've got a constant level of activity that is a mix of all those four types. Now, in order to start to manage our symptoms, we need to give the body a little bit of support in how much activity we engage in and how much rest and recuperation the body is required to have to start to recover. Now, the difficulty is, for most people, when their symptoms are severe, the first type of activity they start to pull back on is the physical activity. So physically they do less, with the thought being that the less they're doing physically, the more their body is able to recover. However, now we are able to understand that that's not necessarily the case, because if we just replace that physical activity with other types of activity, such as mental or social interaction, then we actually haven't saved any energy, we've just switched activity type to something different. So we now need to start to think about allowing the body to rest and to recover. And I think rest is a very overused term because I think it means something different to many people. So if we are fit and well, we may consider rest to be something that is relaxing, enjoyable, doesn't involve a lot of stress or intellectual energy. So we might think, if I'm lying on the sofa on an evening, watching something easy on TV, flicking through a magazine or having a look on social media, that's fairly restful because I'm not really feeling like I'm expending a lot of energy. And when we're fit and well, that's absolutely fine. However, when we have a condition such as a long COVID presentation of symptoms, we need to recognise that any activity is using energy, and therefore in order to have rest, we need to be stopping activity and allowing the body a period of recovery and recuperation. Now, rest therefore needs to be considered as a pure task on its own. So rest has to be the complete removal from any sort of activity. So we can't be moving around anywhere, we're not doing anything physical. We're not doing any mental type activities, so we're not engaged in TV, we're not looking at a screen such as a phone or a tablet or a laptop, we're not reading anything, we're not listening to the radio or a podcast. Socially, we're not interacting with other people, so we aren't chatting, we're not listening to conversations. Now, we can't switch off our emotions for our emotional activity. We can't switch that off completely. However, if we stop the other three types of activity, the physical, the mental and the social, the only energy our body is using is keeping us ticking over, keeping us alive. So we're not using any extra energy to engage in anything else. Therefore, it is that at that point that the body is able to purely rest. And within that rest can allow some recuperation, some recovery, some recharge, if you like, from the activity that it's been doing beforehand and readiness for the activity that it's going to do next. So we need to consider rest to be an isolated act on its own, and we need to think about removing all other activity around us so that our rest is pure, and it needs to be regular throughout the day. So we don't want to sit and do nothing for huge long periods because obviously that's not pleasant to do and counterproductive. We want to have a balance of some activity but some rest and recovery as well. So what we tend to look at is we think of the time that you get up on a morning, think of the time that in an ideal world you're kind of going to bed on a night. You're giving yourself some sort of parameter for the day. And that's the period of time that we need to manage because that is our activity period of time. So we want to be able to do some activity, but then we want to stop, have a rest period, recover, and then move on to some more activity. So if, depending on severity of symptoms, if you've got up on a morning, You have maybe got dressed, you've maybe come downstairs, you've maybe had some breakfast, you've maybe engaged with the family, so a bit of social interaction. If you've been up about an hour and a half, that's a considerable amount of activity that you've already engaged in. And we therefore want to stop activity at that point, and we want to allow some rest, some recovery, before we continue with the rest of the activity of the day. So we stop and we have a rest period. So that means just sit yourself down, peace and quiet, no screens, no interaction, just watch the world go by. And it only needs to be for 10, 15 minutes maximum. Once that rest period is over, continue with what you were doing. So put the TV back on, go back to the laptop, go back to chatting to family, whatever it was you wanted to engage in, or whatever it was that you were going to occupy time with, that's absolutely fine. Go back to it. However, after another hour, hour and a half maximum, stop again. 10 to 15 minutes rest. So put everything down, switch everything off, pause whatever you're doing, allow yourself that 10 to 15 minutes of pure rest, and then from then, go back to what you were doing again. So what we're doing is we're taking that period of activity that is your day, and we're allowing a bit of activity, stop, rest, recover. A bit of activity, stop, rest, recover. We are basically saying to the body, okay, we know that you're trying to rein us in, we know you're trying to restrict us with these symptoms, so what we're going to do is we are going to take control of this. We are going to be in control of how much activity we do. We're not going to keep going for the whole day. We're going to do a small amount, an hour, hour and a half, then we're going to stop. We're going to have a 10-15 minute rest period, then we're going to continue again for another hour, hour and a half, then we're going to rest again. And by breaking up the day all the way through to bedtime with activity and some rest, this means that we're allowing a tolerance to build up to activity, but the body knows it's going to have an allowance for rest as well. We're getting the body to trust us that we are going to do activity in an appropriate time scale with enough recovery time that it doesn't have to intervene with symptoms to stop us, because we are taking control of that and we are allowing it recovery time as well as activity time. And this is the first step in building up a tolerance to activity and allowing the symptoms to reduce, because they're not needed to stop us and rein us back in. The amount of activity that we do and the amount of rest that we need varies hugely from person to person, and obviously depends on the severity of symptoms. There are some patients whose symptoms are at a level of severity where they're able to function generally through the day, although they're feeling unwell. And therefore we could allow maybe hour and a half to 2 hours of activity, and then a 10-15 minute rest, then another couple of hours of activity. And that's enough to start to see an improvement in symptoms and a stabilisation throughout the day of how their symptoms present. Other people's severity levels will be higher, and therefore we may actually reduce that person to be doing an activity period of an hour, 45 minutes even, half an hour, depending how poorly they are, and we would then look at how much rest is needed before the next period of activity. And that's all about negotiation regarding their tolerance to the activity, the severity of their symptoms, and how poorly they are in general with their long COVID condition. So in general, what I would say that the main advice to everybody is, first of all, look at the day that you are managing, so the time you're normally out of bed or the time you're sort of up through the day and going back to bed. And I appreciate that's not always as it should be when you have a condition like this, but very much start to look at rest periods being put into that day, dropped in throughout the day to break up the activity and allow your body some rest and recovery. Thank you.